Welcome to the Above and Beyond Recovery Podcast, where we explore recovery and its relationship to faith, family, work, community, and health.
Hello, I am Amber Didden, today's host of the Above and Beyond Recovery Podcast. On today's episode, we'll be exploring the history of addiction treatment and how have treatment approaches developed over time. Our guest today is Michael Fanjoy. As many of you know, this show is produced by Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge, and Michael is our Vice President of Quality and Compliance at Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Our topic today is about the history of addiction treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a little bit of I won't call myself a history buff because I don't know enough facts to call myself that, but I am fascinated by history. I love watching documentaries about the past. And as we've been thinking about the topics we wanted to talk about on the show, I kind of wondered, where did addiction treatment even come from? You and I work at an addiction treatment facility. And so I just thought, back through the ages, how have people helped people who struggled with some kind of substance abuse? And I can imagine if I had to take a guess at where those beginnings were. There's a story in the Bible about Noah drinking too much wine and he kind of gets himself into some trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And so, back in biblical times, I'm sure it was probably wine and alcohol. And
Mm-hmm.
what did people do? Did they ostracize them? Did they... where did it come from? So
Sure.
I kind of want to start the conversation there. At the earliest points,
Mm-hmm.
what do we know about how people started helping people with addictions?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, in my notes and my studies, I studied a little bit and have a little bit about Noah and his wine and vineyards. And so it's funny that you use that as a reference. But I guess the earliest recordings that we have, really, one of them is 5000 BC. And according to a publication of 1989, The History of Wine, the oldest seeds of cultivated vines discovered and carbon dated were from 7,000 to 5,000 BC.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, isn't that crazy? It shows that mushrooms were used as in Central Asia as religious rituals for at least 4,000 years. Homer's Odyssey alludes to the potion that many Greek scholars believed to be derived from opium.
Oh, interesting.
And there is general agreement that the Samaritans cultivated poppies and isolated opium from their seed capsules around the 3rd millennium BC. So
oh my gosh, so it's
this
been around
goes
for a while.
way back, even before a lot of what we read in biblical times, but also in biblical times too. Noah's first act upon emerging from the ark was to build a vineyard. So,
Which, if I had been on a boat for 40 days with a bunch of animals and my family, I might be making some poor decisions. So,
exactly.
there we are.
Yep.
Okay.
So a couple others. Ancient Egypt, water lilies known as blue lotus flowers were consumed during ritual celebrations. Both hashish and coffee were commonly used in the Islamic world and later quickly spread to Europe into the New World. And fermentation gave way to distillation in Europe. Alcohol for cereal grains became more potent, and leading to increased impact of alcohol on health and well-being in the early times in Europe. So
I'm guessing that's pre-medieval ages.
yes. Mm-hmm.
Is that
exactly.
where we kind of first start hearing about alcohol becoming a problem or substance use becoming a problem in history, do you think?
Well, I think, you mentioned the Bible, and so, being a faith-based organization that we are, we rely heavily on that, and we see a lot of the challenges alluded to in the Bible there. There's a lot of scriptures that speak to drunkenness and being of sober mind. And probably, I would say that that's where maybe in history we first start seeing that certain writings addressing the effects of the alcohol and the substances and how to kind of combat that, of course, using biblical understanding and things like that. So we see that.
So what kind of records outside of the Bible? I know the Bible has some guidance on how to stay away from drunkenness, but are there any kind of historical references that we see about people trying to help people with addictions or how they addressed those kinds of problems?
Some of the early philosophers discussed the effects of alcoholism and talked about it as detrimental to society and things like that, and they addressed it. So Another neat thing too, though, getting back to the Bible, is we also see the use of drugs in the Bible as well in the
Really?
word sorcery. Yeah, and this is something that I
Oh, I
did
feel
some
like you were
research.
telling me about this
hmm
before. Okay, so go into that a little bit.
So sorcery stems from the root word pharmakia,
Uh-huh.
which also translates as witchcraft in the Bible.
Interesting.
And this also is a root word for pharmacy. And so when we find sorcery or witchcraft in the Bible, it refers to the use of drugs or hallucinogenics for mind-altering purposes like narcotics. And so a lot of people, they read the witchcraft, they read sorcery, and they think kind of like what we
Harry
see,
Potter.
right, on Harry Potter, stuff like that. But in
Right.
biblical times, it was solely around the use of mind-altering substances.
Right. So in the Bible, we see some guidance. We see some guidance in like Greek philosophy. Where did you start seeing in your research that people started what we kind of see now as like addiction treatment?
So this was very fascinating for me because I've been working in the field now, geez, probably about 20 years, maybe not quite 20 years, but and I also love history as well. So I fall asleep at the History
Yeah.
Channel and stuff like that, and I'm always trying to find different documentaries and things. So I thought, I knew a lot about history and treatment. I knew the story of Bill W. and
Bill
AA, and
W.
yes, Bill Wilson is the story. He founded AA.
Okay.
So, and that was that's in here as well. In, I think it was 1930s is when he founded AA. And so to me, that was like, okay, that's probably when it started. Because AA is huge,
Right.
Alcoholics Anonymous,
Right.
right? Narcotics Anonymous. It's a huge program. It's been around for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
There also is the Minnesota model that I'll get to in a little bit. And that was also founded around that time, 1930s, 1940s. But in my study, I found that in the early 1900s, actually there's a couple others before that, but in the early 1900s, Dr. Leslie E. Keeley developed a program, an addiction treatment program. And according to the North Dakota State University archives, Keeley Institutes were franchise facilities that served people in addiction to alcohol, nicotine, and narcotic drugs, and one of the first institutes to treat alcoholism as a disease, which is
Wow.
very interesting because the 1900s is way before,
Right.
right, AA and NA and a lot of what we think of today.
Right.
And I know a lot of times, even today, a lot of people still struggle with the idea of addiction being a disease. And so as someone who does a lot of trainings and things like that, I'm working on the neurobiology of addiction, and a lot of the neurobiology of addiction talks about what happens in the brain, and that the fact that it is a disease because of what happens to the brain over long-term periods of use. And there's a lot of people who still kind of struggle with that. They feel like it's more of a moral type of thing, and it's a choice thing, and at one point in time it is, but then it kind of develops something else. But we're still having that debate today, right? When
Right.
in the 1900s, there is documentation that this was identified as a disease and an effective form of treatment as that. And so at that time, the Keeley had founded over 200 treatment centers in the United States. There was one in every state at that time.
Really?
In 1900.
In 1900, there
1902.
was a treatment facility in every state.
In every state, yes.
Wow.
And there was over 200 across the United States. And they even have statistics of their outcomes.
Really?
Which is crazy.
Okay,
Yes.
so tell me
So
about it.
50% success rate, they
Wow.
claim. And
Okay.
through again, a lot of this research was done through the University of North Dakota. And people who recovered from their problems stayed well because in addition to seemingly useless injections, so they also had lots of potions and things like that. They actually had MAT back then,
Right.
medication assisted treatment.
Okay.
And so their MAT back then was cocaine and opium.
Get out. Okay, so somebody in the year 1900 could be struggling with an alcohol addiction, could go to one of these treatment facilities, and among the plethora of treatments, one of them might be a cocaine injection.
Or
Very
opium.
interesting.
Yes,
Or
depending
opium.
on what their substance of
Right.
choice is, right?
Interesting. Okay.
And so, but a lot of what they attribute to their success rate, which was very fascinating, is that they encourage group therapy and exchange of information, as well as getting community involvement.
Wow.
So a lot of people feel like these are precursors to like what the treatment is that we have today,
it
and the
definitely
12
feels
steps and
similar.
things like that.
So were these treatment facilities residential, do you know?
Yes, they were called inebriate homes. Is one of the
Inebriate
original
homes.
terms for this.
Okay.
1864, and an inebriate home was developed as asylums, served as refugees. The terminology too that they used
Yeah.
back then is so different. But for those who battled alcoholism, one of the first of these inebriate homes, these residential facilities, was in New York State. An inebriate asylum opened in 1864. That was
1864.
mm-hmm.
Wow.
Isn't that fascinating?
That is so fascinating. Okay. So we've got these homes set up for people. They can go there, and mostly it sounds like alcohol addiction. Did you see any research about any other substances?
I did. So in around this time, the Civil War was going on, and so many people in the Civil War became addicted to morphine because of and so they developed an opium habit, and I think that was in kind of like what our modern day opiate challenges are that we face probably stemmed from like the Civil War, and the roots are really
And those kinds of challenges you're talking about, like people receiving a prescription from their doctor,
exactly,
and starting under that care, and then it just kind of getting out of control. So you're saying even that kind of problem started in the Civil War, where with soldiers being treated with morphine, and then it just kind of spiraling.
At this time, an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Americans were addicted to opium.
Wow.
And one Union soldier held prisoner at Andersville, given morphine upon his release, described in stark detail what happened when he attempted to quit. So they talk about withdrawal, and he actually details what withdrawal went through back then in 1876 in a publication called Opium Eating, an autobiographical sketch by a habituate.
Interesting. Okay. So not only do we see kind of that medical pattern happening, we also see it starting with veterans too, which is a huge deal even today. So some of the earliest people being treated for substance use disorder were veterans.
Correct.
Wow.
And in the late 1870s, there was a program called Homes for the Fallen. And these were for veterans, basically, and then there were inebriate asylums. And the usual treatments were institutions involved isolation, detoxification, and dangerous processes involving administrations, everything from poisonous substances they would use to help people in that time.
Did you see any kind of correlation between mental health at that point, or was it being treated as something very separate from mental health, or did people see it as kind of going hand in hand with maybe anxiety, depression, or some of the things that we see today?
I see it threaded. I see mental health and substance use threaded throughout history, kind of like it is today. They called it disease of the mind. Kind of even backtracking a little bit to first American history. Benjamin Rush was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he was also a pioneer of American addiction medicine. Although he believed, as most physicians of his day, that treatments such as bleeding and purging in mercury would cure the insanity. So that's another indication of the mental illness along with the substance abuse, because they would call it insanity too, and so they would link them together back then. He also took a number of revolutionary positions, such as advocacy of occupational therapy at that time. In 1812, he wrote a book titled Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Disease of the Mind. And so he very much linked it too. And then even another fascinating thing is that, in Indian reservations and things like that, we see a high rate of alcoholism even today. Well, back in the 1750s, communal therapy was embraced by Native American tribes who found their own ranks decimated by the introduction of alcohol to the New World. Writing for The Fix in 2015, Josh Scheid notes that in the 1750s, sobriety circles were formed in Native American tribes across the country. In tradition of the wounded healers, the belief that recovery from a devastating illness is a sign of a healer. So Native American sobriety circles were led by a tribe member who survived their own battles with alcoholism.
Wow.
How amazing is that? And so they would run the groups, right?
Yeah.
So we see that today too. A lot of times those are
that peer
in recovery. Exactly. And this was in 1750s, right? How amazing is that?
So when I came to this conversation just thinking about if I had to come up with a picture of what treatment looked like back in the early days of treatment, I was kind of picturing, and I don't know if I had heard this somewhere, that people who struggled with addictions often ended up in like insane asylums. So that's kind of the picture that I had, is that they kind of got lumped in together and that it was just treated as some kind of mental illness. It does seem like there are parallels, but it also seems like people identified that addiction was something separate and needed separate treatment. Now, some of that treatment was bleeding you out and giving you mercury,
Sure.
which probably was not effective. But still, it's interesting to see that even in those early days, people were saying, hey, addiction is a little bit different than some of these other mental health issues that we see.
Yeah. Another neat thing I see parallels is the influence of government policy on addiction treatment.
Yeah.
So back in the 1900s, going back to the Leslie E. Keeley centers that are across the United States, it was a flourishing treatment community that was going across the whole United States that all of a sudden just kind of disappeared. And it disappeared with the Prohibition Acts. So it's so fascinating to see that the Harrison Act in 1914 put an end to the sale of products containing ingredients derived from opiums or coca leaves, right? And so powders, elixirs, and various other cure-alls that could be bought in catalogs, pharmacies, were no longer for sale legally. Black market began to pick up, and alcoholism soon followed. And then the 18th Amendment started the prohibition, and addiction treatment suffered as well, which is so interesting because we would think, prohibition would have a positive influence on addiction, but it didn't. It had a negative influence. And of course, if we study history, we see that it caused a lot more crime. But when we're kind of going through something like that right now too, with the legalization of marijuana, right? Everyone's discussing, hey, shouldn't it be legalized? Should it be legalized? Shouldn't it be? It's kind of like, we're coming out of the prohibition of marijuana, right? Well, we see that in history, and prohibition actually hindered the ability for treatment centers for a number of reasons. I didn't really get into why that phenomenon happened, but it was interesting. So by in the 1920s, only 11 Keeley Institutes survived the out of sight, out of mind thinking. And so that's kind of, so it's right there that kind of was promoted through this vicariously, right? Secondarily through the prohibition, that's like, it has to all be hidden, right? And so even the fact that if a person has a problem, that has to be hidden as well,
Right.
because now it's promoting a lot of these things. So out of sight, out of mind. So no one wanted to go to treatment anymore. And so then we get into like the stigma that we're dealing with right now, right?
And I was going to say, like, this is a whole other episode, and we already have you kind of scheduled to do an episode about stigma, but it's so fascinating that might even be where some of those origins are, is that, like, you can't seek treatment because seeking treatment in itself is identifying that you have a problem, and in the 1920s, that problem was illegal. So... Right.
Exactly. And so the idea that alcohol was a physical disease necessitating medical treatment was once again replaced with the belief that alcoholism was a lapse of moral character and could be cured by prohibiting inebriation, being inebriated. So the result is that, but some other treatment facilities started to pop up. Salvation Army started around the 1940s. Doctors were using, when they were using morphine and cocaine as MET, the part of them banning that was because I read something that said that back then the government banned it because people were using that for too long, and that they wanted them to be time limited type of thing. And so it's interesting that I saw that in the literature back in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
Because we kind of have that debate right now too with the METs that are available. It's like, okay, what is the end game? Is it for and some people maybe they need to be on it for a good amount of time, but does that mean they need to be on it for the rest of their life? And a lot of people really don't have a good answer to that. And so I think it's interesting that history is kind of repeating itself a little bit. It's a different substance that we're using. Probably much safer than opium and cocaine as it was back then, but it's similar philosophical discussions that we're having in regards to treating people these ways.
So you mentioned a little bit about group therapy being part of these modalities. Did you see that as a large part, or what was kind of like the crux of the treatment at that time through the early 1900s?
In the early times, it was mostly isolation, medication. There was some group therapy, but there wasn't a whole lot of training on what type of therapeutic approaches to use at that time. We have evidence-based approaches now, and there's lots of research that has gone into those evidence-based approaches. Really throughout this time, they was kind of using, this was like experimental time, was trying to figure out. Now we have like cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of the therapies that we have now came out of that time, but they didn't really know, they weren't really formed or structured well. So I would say really that stuff came about back in like the 1930s when AA was founded, and then in 1949, a big step forward in the field of addiction treatment was established via the Hazelden Foundation. And they created the Minnesota model, and that's kind of like the 30-day residential counseling model that we have today for a lot of our short-term residential programs. That was developed in 1949 through the Hazelden Foundation in Minnesota. And so that's where counseling really kind of came into at that time.
Interesting. This was such an awesome conversation. I feel like I got some of my curiosity satisfied, but I still have a lot more questions. But I appreciate you being with us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. There's a lot of details that Michael shared with us today. We're going to put some of those in our show notes and links to some of our resources. So if you've got any other questions, don't forget to email us at AboveBeyond@paatc.org. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us. The Above and Beyond Recovery podcast is a production of Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. If you or a loved one needs help with addiction, call us now at 844-888-8085 or find us online at paatc.org. That information is also in our show notes. Join us next time as we continue the conversation.